Fraud costs taxpayers millions of dollars each year, and public jurisdictions are particularly vulnerable. Fraud involves a deception intended to deprive a person or an organization of something of value. How can you prevent fraud in your jurisdiction? This video will help public officials, public employees, and those who want to protect the public interest understand the concept of fraud. We will also provide useful tips to detect and prevent fraud in the workplace. Please keep in mind that this is a basic overview, a way to introduce you to fraud awareness and prevention. Beyond this overview, there is much more you can learn. What do we mean by fraud? As used in this video, fraud simply means an intentional and deceitful act used to persuade or to cause another party to part with something of value or to be injured in some way. The term fraud is used here as a general term for a variety of misconduct. For example, check tampering, expense reimbursement manipulation, or inflating reported hours on a timesheet are typically frauds. Now let's discuss the 3 pillars of fraud awareness and prevention. The 3 pillars are awareness, understanding, and prevention. Let's discuss each pillar in detail. The first pillar is awareness. When you raise your awareness of what fraud is, including what you need to look out for to identify potential fraud, you've taken the first steps towards preventing fraud in your organization. There are 3 general characteristics of fraud: intent, deception, and an actual or attempted injury or loss to a victim. Usually, whoever commits the fraud does so with the goal of profiting from the fraudulent act. Now let's look at each characteristic in detail. Intent means that the perpetrator of the fraud didn't make a mistake. The perpetrator thought about it and meant to commit the misconduct. Fraud also involves some form of deceit in the furtherance of the misconduct or wrongdoing. For instance, this can take the form of lying, creating a distraction, tampering with records, or covering up facts. Common deceptions include falsifying records, mislabeling funds, or lying to a manager, coworker, client, or another party. Prosecutors often refer to these deceptions as showing consciousness of guilt, meaning the perpetrator knew what they were doing was wrong. And in the third general characteristic, there is usually a victim of the fraud. The fraud deprives this victim of something of value. So, a fraud often results in a victim being injured financially or incurring the loss of something they value. It's important to note that the item of value can vary greatly. We most often assign value to something tangible, something that can be quantified. For example, money or a physical asset like a car or jewelry. However, something of value can also be intangible, meaning that it's difficult to quantify. For example, a professional or personal reputation, self-esteem, and public image. Just as an injury or loss from a fraud can be tangible or intangible, so can the gain or profit from committing a fraud. The motivation for a fraud is usually material gain, something tangible like money. But as we discussed, people place value on many different things, so gain can include intangibles like reputation, professional recognition, or even revenge. In most fraud cases, the person or entity committing the fraud is trying to get or gain something. Otherwise, why would someone take the risk of committing a crime? Now let's explore a few examples of workplace fraud schemes. Examples of fraud include bribery by scheme, theft of assets, and timekeeping abuses. One example of fraud is bribery by scheme. Bribery is the act of offering another person something of value in exchange for getting something you might not otherwise get. It's an arrangement. For example, a contractor might bribe a contract manager to get paid for inferior work or for work that was never completed. Accepting the bribe itself is a crime. However, to be a fraud, this bribery must include an underlying scheme that includes the characteristics of fraud: intent, deceit, and either a loss and/or a gain. If the contract manager falsifies reports in connection with the bribe, this may now be a fraud. Their action shows intent, deceit, and their employer has incurred the loss of the services it paid the contractor for. The money the contract manager received is their gain. Another example of fraud is theft of assets or an inventory theft scheme. Theft is the act of taking something that is not yours. Say an agency routinely purchases laptop computers for staff. The agency does not keep good track of who needs or who gets a laptop, and the purchasing official continues to buy any requested equipment as long as the purchase is within the budget. Knowing this, the information technology or IT manager regularly requests new laptops whether or not there is a need for them. This creates surplus inventory. The IT manager sells the surplus laptops on the internet and keeps the money. To cover up the theft, he writes in his logbook that the employees reported the theft of these laptops, that these laptops could not be repaired and were discarded, or the laptops were assigned to employees. The IT manager is involved in asset theft. This also is a fraud. He intentionally ordered equipment he did not need and made false log entries to cover his tracks. The loss to the agency is the dollar value of the laptops. Let's take a look at a very common fraud. One of the most common types of abuse is time skimming. Say you have a 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. work schedule, but come in at 10 a.m. and leave at 4 p.m. This is done without permission. By doing this, you have reduced or skimmed your schedule by 2 hours a day, which equals 10 hours every work week. Since you are paid to work a 40-hour work week, this is about 25% of your total weekly work hours. Now, what value does this have? Well, let's say your salary is $60,000 a year. If you have skimmed your time by 25%, then in effect, you've stolen $15,000 worth of time from your employer. This is time theft. But what makes this a fraud? Knowingly reducing your time shows intent. Your deception is falsely reporting your time worked. The loss is the value of your time to your employer. This is a fraud. Now that you can identify the characteristics of fraud, let's look at who commits frauds. The answer might surprise you. Fraudsters typically appear law-abiding. They are not career criminals, and they're unlikely to be considered suspects by their coworkers. They are usually seen as good employees, and they've earned increased responsibility and authority within the organization. But this authority they've been given also creates fraud opportunity. We'll discuss this in more detail in the next segment. The second pillar of fraud awareness and prevention is understanding. Once you become aware of fraud, you need to understand why fraud occurs. Having this context will enable you to identify some of the signs of fraud. Criminologist Donald Cressy explains why people commit fraud through a theory referred to as the fraud triangle. This theory suggests that most frauds occur when the following conditions exist: motivation, justification, and opportunity. Now let's take a look at each condition in detail. The first condition is motivation. An individual needs to have a reason or motivation to commit the fraud. This is also sometimes referred to as feeling pressure or having a need. Now, let's look at examples of motivations that may lead to someone committing frauds. Lifestyle choices are considered the number one motivation for fraud. Many people face societal and family pressures to live a lifestyle or want something that is beyond their financial means. For example, a new luxury car, a bigger house, an exotic vacation, or a boat they can't afford. A person may also be motivated by financial pressures like gambling debts or needing a new roof on their house. Other motivators could be work-related performance pressures like meeting deadlines or sales goals. Some people commit frauds because of pressure to help friends, relatives, or the company they work for. A fraudster will act on these pressures. The second condition of the fraud triangle theory is justification. A person needs to justify or rationalize a bad act because most people know the difference between right and wrong. When we convince ourselves of the acceptability of something that is wrong, this is called justification. Now let's look at some common justifications for rationalizing fraud. A person may try to rationalize a misdeed by convincing themselves that everyone does it, or that it's payment for some perceived mistreatment. The number one justification for committing fraud is that the money is being borrowed. It's only a loan. The justification is that a loan is not a theft because borrowing is not a crime. Of course, if it's really okay, then why not go straight to your boss and ask about your loan? The third and final condition of the fraud triangle is opportunity. Even when someone is motivated and can justify doing something wrong, they still need to be able to commit the fraud. The opportunity must exist. Examples of opportunities to commit fraud may include an unlocked cash box, poor inventory controls, or weak checks and balances. The right opportunity may also be finding a password to get unauthorized access to the accounting system, or the fraudster having the authority to approve financial transactions with no supervisory oversight. Most often, opportunities exist because of weak internal controls. Internal controls are the policies, procedures, and practices established to protect an organization from financial losses and other risks. Examples of internal controls include requiring 2 signatures on checks and other financial documents, segregating duties to avoid possible conflicts, and having oversight for financial transactions. We will discuss more about internal controls in the next segment of the video. Now that you can identify the characteristics of fraud and understand how fraud can occur, we need to discuss the third pillar, prevention. Let's look at what you can do to prevent or deter fraud from impacting your jurisdiction. How do we deter fraud and lower our risk of injury or loss from fraud? Our first line of defense is establishing effective internal controls that limit opportunities for workplace fraud. As already mentioned, segregating duties and management oversight are key controls. Also vital to fraud deterrence is having an appropriate tone at the top. This means that the culture of the organization and the approach of management, from the top down, is one that understands fraud risk, will not tolerate fraud in the workplace, and actively seeks to prevent and detect fraud. Other internal controls might include having job rotation to ensure shared responsibility for important activities like payment reconciliation. As a result, a single person is not in total control of an activity. Remember the saying, trust but verify. Frauds are harder to hide when there are strong internal controls that ensure transparent transactions and employee accountability. In addition to internal controls, you should develop a fraud prevention program that includes providing fraud awareness training to employees and conducting audits and reviews, including surprise document reviews and cash counts. A fraud prevention program should also have a way for employees to report fraud. For example, a hotline. An effective program will also ensure employees know how to report potential frauds. When developing internal controls, consider where you may be vulnerable to loss by conducting a fraud risk assessment. You can do this by reviewing your organizational activities to identify weaknesses and how you might be victimized by a fraud scheme. The controls you choose to use should address these risks. For a very simple example, if the file cabinet where you store taxpayer credit card information does not lock, then consider moving the files to a cabinet that locks. The lock is your control. Internal controls can also be developed to address so-called red flags. Red flags are typically indicators that signal potential fraud risks. These red flags should be looked into, but they are not evidence of a fraud. For example, earlier when we discussed the fraud triangle, we mentioned lifestyle changes as a fraud motivator. Say your accounts receivable clerk recently purchased a yacht. It's prudent for you to ensure that your internal controls over the receivables function are adequate and working well. You can also make some inquiries about these noticeable lifestyle changes. According to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, some of the most common red flags of behavioral fraud exhibited by employees are living beyond their means, personal or family financial difficulties, unusually close relationships with a client or vendor, recent changes in family situation like a divorce, and excessive control of their work or an unwillingness to share job duties. These red flags should trigger the organization to, at the very least, ensure that adequate controls are in place for the activities the employee exhibiting red flags is engaged in. Now you know the basics of fraud awareness and prevention. This introductory video is intended to help you understand the concept of fraud and to give you some basic steps for detecting and preventing fraud in the workplace. We hope this video raised your awareness of fraud and provided you with an incentive to learn more about fraud and how to prevent it.
Hello, I am Jeffrey Shapiro, the Commonwealth's Inspector General. As a member of the public here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, you can play an important role in assisting the Office of the Inspector General fulfill its mandate to prevent and detect fraud, waste, and abuse of public resources. If you suspect that public resources, funds, property, or land is subject to waste, fraud, or abuse, I urge you to contact our fraud hotlines. Many of our cases started as hotline tips. All tips are confidential and will be reviewed by an investigator. The OIG also offers a training program, the OIG Academy, to provide public employees and those doing business with the Commonwealth with the tools they need to manage public resources well and to protect those resources from fraud, waste, and abuse. If you would like to know more about our courses, please visit our website to learn more. Thank you again for your interest.